Frank McAllister, a 74-year-old Navy veteran, lives quietly in Havenport, Maine, until his beloved boat, Harbor Angel, is destroyed by Eli Grayson's reckless yacht. The incident, captured on video, goes viral, mocking Frank's loss. His grandson David pushes for justice, but Frank remains stoic, clinging to his Navy flag. Unexpectedly, 6 Navy ships arrive, led by Admiral Grant, to honor Frank's heroic past. As the town watches, a billionaire's apology and a new boat emerge. But what lies ahead for Frank? Will Havenport truly change, or is this just a fleeting moment? Love Frank's story? Share it with a like and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell for more inspiring tales. Comment below about someone whose quiet strength touched you. Let's keep these stories alive, honoring respect and connection across generations. Join us for the next story. At 74, Frank McAllister carried the weight of his years in his aching knees and the persistent twinge in his lower back, each step a quiet testament to a life well lived. Yet his hands remained steady, his mind a sharp blade honed by decades of discipline. In the small fishing town of Havenport, Maine, nestled along the rugged Atlantic coast, Frank was a fixture, as much a part of the landscape as the weathered lighthouse or the barnacle-crusted pilings of the old dock. His modest white cottage perched on a gentle rise above the harbor, a short walk down a gravel path to the water's edge. The front porch, simple and unadorned, held a creaking rocking chair, a faded doormat, and a flagpole where the American flag flew without fail, rain or shine. That flag was more than fabric to Frank. It was a symbol of duty, of sacrifice, of the years he'd served in the Navy during the Korean War. He rarely spoke of those days, the memories tucked away like old letters in a drawer. But the habits they instilled, rising before dawn, working with calloused hands, respecting the sea's vast and unpredictable power, were woven into the very fiber of his being. On this particular morning, Frank moved through his routine with the unhurried precision of a man who had done it 1,000 times. He filled his thermos with black coffee, its bitter warmth a comfort against the chill of the dawn. His bait bucket was packed, his old cap pulled low over his thinning gray hair, shielding eyes that still caught every detail of the world around him. As he stepped onto the gravel path, the air carried the sharp tang of salt and the faint dampness of morning mist. The harbor lay quiet, the world holding its breath as if waiting for the sun to break the horizon. At the bait shack near the docks, Frank spotted young Tommy Martin, a boy no older than 10, wrestling with a fishing line. The boy's small hands fumbled with a stubborn knot, his brow furrowed in frustration. "Morning, Tommy," Frank called, his voice gravelly but softened by kindness, like a stone smoothed by the tide. "Looks like that line's got you in a bind." Tommy's cheeks flushed red, a mix of embarrassment and determination. "Yeah, Mr. Frank," he mumbled, his fingers still tugging uselessly at the tangle. "I just can't get it to budge." Frank crouched beside him, his knees protesting the motion, but his hands moving with the ease of muscle memory. "Here's the trick, son," he said, his weathered fingers deftly looping the line. "You've got to coax it, not force it. Loop it like this, see? Then pull it through here, nice and easy, she'll hold fast." He worked the knot free with a gentle tug, and Tommy's face broke into a grin, his eyes bright with gratitude and a spark of pride. "Thanks, Mr. Frank," he said, clutching the line as if it were a hard-won trophy. Frank gave a small nod, a flicker of warmth in his chest at the boy's earnestness, and continued down the dock. That was Frank, quiet, unassuming, always ready to lend a hand without expecting fanfare. At the end of the dock waited the Harbor Angel, Frank's boat, her faded paint and weathered wood telling a story of years spent battling the sea. She wasn't much to look at, not like the sleek vessels that sometimes docked in Havenport, but every plank, every nail, had been placed by Frank's own hands. After the war, when his mind was a storm of memories he couldn't quiet, building the Harbor Angel had been his salvation. She was more than a boat. She was his anchor, his refuge, a tangible piece of peace in a world that could be so chaotic. Frank climbed aboard, his movements careful but sure, and checked his lobster traps with the same meticulous care he'd always given them. As he prepared to push off, the sun cracked the horizon, spilling pink and gold across the sky, the water reflecting the colors like a painter's canvas. The gentle lap of waves against the hull wrapped Frank in a fleeting sense of calm, a moment where the world felt right, whole, and his. But such moments, he knew, were fragile. A low rumble broke the stillness, a vibration that thrummed through the punk and into Frank's bones. He turned, his brow furrowing, his eyes scanning the water. Around the bend came the Silver Arrow, a gleaming yacht that cut through the harbor like a blade through silk. It was a thing of ostentatious beauty, all polished steel and glass, moving with an arrogance that seemed to claim the water itself. On its upper deck, a crowd of young people laughed and swayed, music blaring from speakers, champagne glasses catching the morning light. Frank's stomach tightened, a knot of unease forming as he recognized the vessel. It belonged to Eli Grayson, a tech billionaire who'd recently swept into Havenport, buying up the grandest beachfront property and stirring whispers among the locals. Grayson was a symbol of change, of a town slipping from its roots into a playground for the wealthy. Frank usually ignored the gossip, but today the Silver Arrow was bearing down on him, its engines roaring, its wake churning the water into froth. He raised his arms, waving both hands, his voice straining against the din. "Hey, watch it," he shouted, but the music and engines swallowed his words. The harbor angel bobbed helplessly in the yacht's wake, her old frame creaking under the strain. Frank's heart pounded, a mix of fear and frustration surging through him. He gripped the wheel, trying to reverse, but the engine coughed and sputtered, too old to match the yacht's speed. His hands tightened, knuckles white, as the Silver Arrow showed no sign of slowing. Then came the sickening crunch of steel against wood. The impact threw Frank sideways, his shoulder slamming against the deck as the yacht sliced through the stern of his boat. Splinters flew, the harbor angel groaning as she broke apart. Frank scrambled, his body protesting but his instincts sharp, and leaped for the dock just as his boat began to disintegrate beneath him. The American flag, the one he'd flown on the stern every day for 40 years, tore free in the chaos, tumbling into the churning sea. From the yacht's deck, a voice rang out, light and careless, laced with laughter. "It's just an old boat, man." The words hit Frank like a slap, but he barely registered them. He lay on the dock, catching his breath, his knees throbbing, his shoulders screaming with pain. His eyes stayed fixed on the water, searching until he caught a glimpse of red, white, and blue amid the wreckage. Slowly, painfully, he pulled himself to his feet and limped to the edge of the dock. His hand reached down, trembling slightly, and closed around the wet fabric of the flag. He pulled it from the waves, clutching it to his chest, the damp cloth heavy against his heart. For a long moment he stood there, the world fading around him, the flag a lifeline to something deeper. Duty, honor, the man he'd always been. A crowd had gathered, joggers pausing mid-stride, tourists with their phones raised, dock workers shifting uncomfortably. No one approached, no one offered a hand. Their silence felt like a weight, a reminder of how easily the world could overlook a man like Frank. That evening he sat at his kitchen table in the quiet of his cottage, the flag spread out before him, its edges frayed but its colors still vivid despite the dampness. His fingers traced the stars, his mind heavy with the day's events. The harbor angel was gone, shattered like a piece of his soul. Yet the flag, this small piece of cloth, held firm in his hands, a symbol of resilience, of everything he'd fought for and held dear. His grandson David had driven in from out of town, his face a mix of concern and quiet anger as he looked at the flag, at Frank's weathered hands. "You okay, Grandpa?" David asked, his voice soft but searching. Frank didn't answer right away. He just sat there holding the flag, his heart full of a quiet, unyielding strength. By dawn the next day, the harbor was transformed. 6 Navy ships stood in formation, their gray hulls gleaming under the early light, a solemn and powerful presence. The crowd was larger now, locals and visitors alike. Their murmurs hushed as Admiral Grant's voice cut through the morning air. "Chief McAllister," he said, his tone carrying the weight of respect. "Today we honor you." Frank stood before them, the flag draped over his heart, his back straight despite the ache in his bones. Sailors snapped to salute, their movements crisp and unified, a tribute to a man who had served, who had endured. Frank's eyes met the crowd, his gaze steady but not proud. I'm proud, just resolute. In that moment, he wasn't just an old man on a dock, overlooked by a changing world. He was Chief McAllister, a man whose life had been shaped by duty, whose quiet strength had left a mark deeper than any yacht could erase. Frank McAllister sat in the dim glow of his small living room, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. His calloused fingers traced the frayed edges of the American flag draped across his lap, each star a silent reminder of years spent at sea, of a life built on hard work and quiet pride. The news had reached his grandson David, who had driven all the way from Boston, his footsteps now echoing with restless energy as he paced the worn wooden floor. "You can't just let this go, Grandpa," David said, his voice taut with indignation. "That guy ran over your boat like it was nothing, like you were nothing. We need to do something. Call a lawyer. Get the media involved. Make him pay." Frank's gaze lingered on the flag, his thumb brushing over the fabric as if searching for an answer woven into its threads. "It's just a boat, David," he murmured, though the words felt hollow even to him. David stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing with disbelief. "Just a boat? Grandpa, you built that boat. Every plank, every nail. It was yours. It mattered." Frank's voice softened to a near whisper, heavy with a grief he couldn't quite name. "It mattered to me when—" Outside, the harbor sparkled under the festive glow of party lights strung across the docks. The sleek yacht, the Silver Arrow, glinted like a blade in the water, its music and laughter drifting faintly through the open window. Frank reached for the lamp, his hand trembling slightly as he flicked it off, watching the harbor's last shimmer fade into darkness. As the room fell silent, he wondered what kind of world awaited him when the sun rose, a world that seemed to care so little for the things he held dear. The next morning, Havenport woke under a sky streaked with pale clouds, the kind that promised neither rain nor warmth. Lobster boats chugged out from the docks, their engines a familiar hum against the screech of seagulls circling overhead. Tourists wandered the waterfront, clutching coffee cups and snapping photos of the quaint seaside town. To the untrained eye, it was just another day in this sleepy coastal haven. But for Frank, standing on his weathered porch, the world felt like a shell of itself, empty, brittle, and cold. His coffee had long gone tepid in his hands, his eyes fixed on the vacant slip where the harbor angel had once bobbed gently, a steadfast companion for 40 years. That boat had been more than wood and fiberglass. It was a repository of memories, sunrises over glassy water, the laughter of friends long gone, the quiet comfort of routine. Now it was gone, reduced to splinters by the reckless wake of a billionaire's yacht and the careless mirth of strangers who'd never know its worth. The crunch of gravel snapped Frank from his reverie as David's car rolled into the driveway. His grandson stepped out, phone in hand, his face etched with a mix of anger and urgency. "Grandpa," David said, climbing the porch steps, "have you seen this?" Frank shook his head, his eyes still tethered to the empty slip. David thrust the phone toward him, and Frank's heart sank as he watched the shaky video unfold on the screen. There he was, waving frantically from the dock, his voice lost in the roar of the yacht's engine. The harbor angel shuddered, then shattered like kindling under the Silver Arrow's wake. And there in the final frame was Frank himself, kneeling on the splintered dock, pulling his soaked flag from the sea, the stars and stripes dripping with salt water. The video's title stung like a slap. "Old Man Loses Boat to Yacht, LOL." David's voice trembled with fury. "It's everywhere, Grandpa. TikTok, Facebook, Twitter. People are laughing at you. Look at these comments. Should have retired that relic years ago. Boomer wreck. Who let Grandpa near the water? It's disgusting." Frank gave a slow, weary shrug, his face unreadable. "It's just noise, David. Let it pass." But David's fists clenched, his frustration spilling over. "No, this isn't right. We need to fight back. Call the news, get a lawyer, make that billionaire pay for what he did." Frank turned away, descending the porch steps toward the water's edge, the morning breeze tugging at his faded jacket. "It was just a boat," he said softly, though the words felt like a betrayal of his own heart. David followed, his voice rising with conviction. It's not about the boat, Grandpa. It's about respect. It's about what's fair. At the harbor, life moved on as it always did. Fishermen hauled traps onto the docks, their hands steady with years of practice. Tourists posed for selfies against the backdrop of bobbing boats, oblivious to the man walking among them. But Frank felt the weight of their glances, some pitying, some awkward, a few tinged with the detached curiosity of those who'd only seen him as a viral spectacle on their screens. He passed the marina office where Jim, the harbor master, stood clutching a clipboard, his face flushed with unease. Frank, Jim began, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I talked to the insurance folks this morning. They're saying the Harbor Angel didn't meet modern safety codes. No radar reflectors, no navigation lights. You know how they are. They're calling it a total loss. No coverage. Frank nodded, his expression unchanged, though a quiet ache spread through his chest. I figured, he said. Jim's voice softened, tinged with guilt. I'm real sorry, Frank. If there's anything I can do. Frank cut him off gently. Thanks, Jim. You've done enough. He walked to the edge of the dock, his hands gripping the weathered railing as he stared out over the harbor. Across the water, the Silver Arrow gleamed under the morning sun, its polished hull a stark contrast to the modest boats around it. The faint clink of champagne glasses carried on the breeze, mingled with distant laughter in the thump of music. Another party, another carefree day for Eli Grayson, the man whose yacht had upended Frank's world. To Grayson, it was just a weekend jaunt. To Frank, it was the closing of a chapter, the loss of something irreplaceable. That evening, Frank sat at his kitchen table, the house enveloped in a stillness broken only by the steady tick of an old wall clock. Before him lay the logbook he'd kept for 4 decades, its pages filled with meticulous notes, weather patterns, tide schedules, catch records, in fleeting moments of truth scribbled to no one but himself. His pen hovered over a blank page, then moved with deliberate care. First day without Harbor Angel. Feels wrong. He closed the book, his hands resting atop it as if to anchor himself. Above the table on a shelf worn by time sat a wooden chest, his Navy chest, scarred from years of moves, deployments, and memories he rarely dared to revisit. With a slow, almost reverent motion, he reached for it, pulling it down and lifting the lid. Inside were medals he seldom showed, photographs of young sailors whose faces were frozen in time, and at the bottom, his carefully folded retirement flag. His fingers brushed the fabric, and for a moment, he was back on the deck of a Navy ship, the sea stretching endlessly before him, a younger man full of purpose. Headlights swept across the window, and David let himself in, dropping into the chair across from Frank. Grandpa, he said softly, his voice gentler now, but still laced with resolve. You don't have to just accept this. Frank looked up, his eyes steady but weary, carrying the weight of a lifetime's lessons. David, I've spent my life making peace with things I couldn't change. Storms at sea, men who didn't come home, years that slipped away. This is just one more. David's fists tightened on the table, his anger flaring anew. This isn't like those things, Grandpa. That man wrecked your boat. He humiliated you in front of the world. He should pay for it. Frank leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his gaze drifting to the flag in his hands. What would it fix, David? A new boat wouldn't bring back the mornings on the water, the quiet out there when it was just me and the sea. It wouldn't bring back the men in those pictures. His voice grew quieter, almost confessional. It was never just the boat. David sat in silence, his anger simmering but tempered by the depth of his grandfather's words. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you ever regret staying here in this town? Frank's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, a flicker of warmth breaking through his stoic facade. I don't regret the town, son. I don't regret the life I built here, the people I've known, the water that's carried me through it all. What I regret. His voice trailed off, and he looked out the window where the harbor lay cloaked in twilight. The Silver Arrow's lights twinkled faintly in the distance, a reminder of a world that moved on without him. What he regretted he couldn't quite say, not yet, but as he folded the flag and placed it back in the chest, he knew the story wasn't over. Not for him, and not for David, whose fire burned bright enough for them both. The harbor lay cloaked in the hush of twilight, its waters shimmering with the faint glow of lights flickering to life along the shore. The distant pulse of music from the Silver Arrow, a yacht moored just beyond the harbor's embrace, mingled with soft bursts of laughter that floated through the cool night air. Frank stood at the edge of his weathered porch, his hands gripping the railing, his gaze lost in the dark expanse of the sea. The weight of years pressed against his chest, each ripple on the water stirring memories of a life spent battling its depths. Storms that had tested his courage, nights when the sea had claimed what he could not save. Behind him, David sat at the kitchen table, his eyes tracing the silhouette of his grandfather against the starry sky. The young man's heart ached with unspoken questions, wondering what thoughts haunted the old man who had raised him, who had always seemed both unbreakable and burdened. No words passed between them, but a shared understanding hung in the air, a quiet recognition that something vast and unspoken was stirring just beyond the horizon, waiting to break upon their small coastal town of Havenport. The next morning, the town awoke to an eerie stillness, as if the world itself held its breath. A thick fog had settled over the harbor, softening the sharp edges of boats and buildings into ghostly shapes that seemed to float in a dreamlike haze. Frank, as was his custom, stood on his porch before dawn, a steaming mug of coffee cradled in his calloused hands. He stared into the gray veil where sea and sky blurred into one, his heart heavy with the absence of the harbor angel, the vessel that had once been his lifeline to the past. For years he'd risen at this hour, driven by habit, waiting for a sign that no longer came, a signal from the sea, a whisper of the lives he'd saved or lost. The loss of the boat had carved a hollow space in him, one he filled with routine to keep the ache at bay, though it lingered like a shadow. But today, something felt different. A low, resonant hum of foghorns rolled through the mist, followed by a sudden and unnatural quiet that blanketed the town. Frank's brow creased, his instincts prickling as he stepped closer to the porch's edge, squinting into the haze, his heart stirring with a mix of curiosity and unease. From the mog, shapes began to emerge, massive, deliberate, and unmistakable. One by one, 6 U.S. Navy ships sliced through the mist, their steel hulls gleaming faintly as they moved in perfect formation into the harbor. The sight sent a jolt through Frank, his heart pounding with a mix of confusion and awe, memories of his own time in uniform flooding back, days of discipline, of danger, of brotherhood. Havenport buzzed with sudden energy. Shopkeepers abandoned their counters, flipping signs to closed as they hurried to the docks, their face alight with curiosity and a touch of fear. Tourists froze mid-step, their cameras forgotten as they gaped at the towering vessels, their minds racing to understand the intrusion into their quiet vacation. Parents instinctively drew their children close, sensing the gravity of the moment, though they couldn't yet name it, their whispers tinged with awe and apprehension. From his perch, Frank watched, his pulse quickening, his mind racing to make sense of the scene. No military exercises had been scheduled, no dignitaries announced. Why had the Navy come to their sleepy little town? The question gnawed at him, stirring a flicker of hope he hadn't dared to feel in years. On the lead ship, a guided missile destroyer, the crew stood in perfect rows, their postures rigid with discipline, their faces set with purpose. At the rail, Rear Admiral Susan Grant stood tall, her white uniform crisp against the muted light, her face a mask of solemn resolve, though her eyes held a quiet empathy. In her hands, she held a folded American flag, its edges precise, its weight heavy with meaning. Frank's breath caught in his throat, his hands trembling as memory surged, images of folded flags handed to grieving families, of ceremonies that honored the fallen. He knew that fold, had performed it himself in years past, after funerals, after losses at sea. It was the fold of honor, the one given to families of those who never returned, a gesture that carried the weight of sacrifice. His hands trembled slightly as he set his coffee mug on the railing, an old instinct stirring deep within him, a call to stand tall as he once had. With deliberate steps, his cane tapping softly against the wooden boards, he descended the porch and began the walk to the harbor, each step heavy with purpose. The crowd parted silently, their eyes following him, a ripple of realization spreading through them as they sensed the significance of his movement, their whispers falling silent. At the water's edge, Admiral Grant stepped ashore, flanked by a formal color guard, their movements precise, their presence commanding. The sailors on all 6 ships remained at attention, their gazes locked on the scene unfolding before them, their silence a testament to the moment's weight. "Chief Petty Officer McAllister," the Admiral's voice rang out, clear and steady, cutting through the stillness of the harbor, her tone carrying both authority and reverence. "Permission to come ashore and render honors." Frank stopped, his shoulders instinctively pulling back, the years melting away in an instant, his body remembering the posture of a younger man, a sailor who had faced storms and sacrifice. He raised a hand in a crisp salute, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions within, pride, grief, and a flicker of disbelief. "Permission granted, Admiral." The Admiral and her guard approached, their footsteps sharp against the weathered dock, each sound echoing in the quiet. She stopped before Frank, presenting the folded flag with both hands, her eyes meeting his with unwavering respect, a silent acknowledgement of his unspoken burdens. "Chief McAllister," she said, her voice carrying not just to him but to the gathered crowd. 43 years ago, you saved the lives of over 100 sailors aboard the USS Providence when a coolant line ruptured during a storm. You refused commendations. You asked only that your brothers be remembered. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth, and a murmur rippled through the onlookers, their faces turning toward Frank with newfound reverence. To them, he had been the quiet old fisherman, a fixture on the docks, weathered and unassuming, his stories tucked away in the lines of his face. Now they saw him anew, a hero who had carried his courage quietly, hidden in plain sight, his humility a shield against the weight of his past. The Admiral's voice grew stronger, yet carried a note of solemnity. "Yesterday, your vessel, the Harbor Angel, was destroyed. No assistance was offered. No respect was shown. Today, the United States Navy has come to acknowledge that your service did not end when you left the uniform, and that your sacrifice has not gone unnoticed." The crowd fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like the fog itself, a stillness more profound than any Frank had known in Havenport. Even the Silver Arrow, moored across the water, had gone quiet, its passengers gathered at the rail, watching with uneasy reverence, their laughter replaced by a hushed acknowledgement of something greater. A young sailor stepped forward, carrying a polished wooden plaque, its surface gleaming in the dim light. With a respectful bow, he handed it to Frank, whose fingers brushed the brass plate, tracing the inscription. "For the man who kept the sea safe even after service, the United States Navy does not forget its own." For a moment, Frank could only stare, his throat tight, his eyes stinging with the weight of memory and recognition. The faces of those he'd saved, those he'd lost, flickered in his mind, their voices mingling with the sea's eternal whisper. "Thank you, Admiral," he managed, his voice soft but steady, carrying the weight of a lifetime. Admiral Grant offered a small, solemn nod, her expression softening, her eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. "We heard about what happened," she said, her voice quieter now, meant for him alone. "From your grandson." He reached out to the Navy Alumni Association. Frank's gaze shifted, finding David into the crowd, his grandson's eyes bright with pride, a faint smile tugging at his lips, a silent promise that he had seen his grandfather's heart all along. A warmth spread through Frank's chest, not the sharp ache of loss, but something softer, something healing, a connection to the boy who had carried his legacy forward. The Admiral's voice dropped further, almost a whisper, her words laced with gentle reproach. "You should have called us, Chief." Frank's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and quiet sorrow. He hadn't sought recognition, hadn't wanted it, content to let his deeds fade into the rhythm of the tides. But standing there with the flag in his hands, the plaque gleaming under the muted light, in the eyes of his town upon him, he felt the weight of his past lifted, if only slightly. The harbor, once a place of routine and loss, now held a new memory, one of honor, of remembrance, of a town and a navy that had not forgotten. In that moment, Frank stood taller, not just as a fisherman, but as a man whose sacrifices had rippled through time, touching lives he'd never sought to claim. The salt-laden breeze swept across Havenport's weathered docks, carrying the faint creak of moored boats and the distant cry of gulls. Frank McAllister stood at the edge of the harbor, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sea met the skyway. The years had etched deep lines into his face, but his posture snapped to attention as a voice called out, crisp and formal, "Harbor, permission to come ashore and render honors." In that moment, time seemed to unravel. Frank's shoulders squared, the weight of decades falling away, and his hand rose in a salute as sharp as it had been 40 years ago. "Permission granted, Admiral," he replied, his voice steady but laced with a tremor of memory. The Admiral, her uniform immaculate, led her guard down the dock, their boots striking the aged wood with a rhythm that echoed like a heartbeat. She stopped before Frank, her gaze holding his with a respect that stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt since he'd hung up his Navy uniform. In her hands, she held a folded American flag, its edges crisp, its stars gleaming under the morning sun. "Chief McAllister," she began, her voice carrying not just to Frank but to the crowd that had gathered, drawn by the unusual sight of naval officers in their quiet fishing town. 43 years ago, you saved over 100 sailors aboard the USS Providence when a coolant line ruptured in the heart of a storm. You turned away commendations, asking only that your fallen brothers be remembered. A ripple of murmurs passed through the onlookers. Heads turned toward Frank, their expressions shifting from curiosity to awe. To them, he had always been the grizzled fisherman mending nets at dawn, his boat, the harbor angel, a familiar silhouette against the sunrise. But now they saw him anew, a hero who had walked among them, his valor hidden beneath the worn fabric of his flannel shirt. Frank felt their gazes, heavy and searching, and his chest tightened with a mix of pride and unease. He had never sought their admiration, only the solace of the sea. The Admiral's voice cut through the murmur. "Yesterday your vessel, the Harbor Angel, was destroyed. No assistance was offered. No respect was shown." Her words hung in the air, sharp and accusing, though not directed at Frank. A hush fell over the crowd, deeper than any Frank had ever known in Havenport. Even the Silver Arrow, a luxury yacht moored across the water, seemed to hold its breath, its passengers lining the rail in uneasy silence, their usual chatter stilled. "Today," the Admiral continued, "the United States Navy acknowledges that your service did not end when you left the uniform, and your sacrifice has not gone unnoticed." A young sailor stepped forward, his movements precise, carrying a polished wooden plaque. He bowed slightly as he handed it to Frank, who accepted it with hands that trembled ever so slightly. His fingers brushed the brass plate, tracing the inscription. "For the man who kept the sea safe even after service, the United States Navy does not forget its own." Frank stared at the words, the flag in his other hand growing heavier with each passing second. His throat constricted, emotions he had long buried rising like a tide. Gratitude, sorrow, pride, they swirled within him, threatening to spill over. "Thank you, Admiral," he managed, his voice rough but clear. The Admiral, her name, Grant, etched on her uniform, offered a solemn nod. In a quieter tone meant for him alone, she added, "We heard about what happened. From your grandson." He reached out to the Navy Alumni Association. Frank's gaze flicked to the crowd, landing on David, his grandson, standing at the edge with eyes bright and a faint, proud smile. A warmth bloomed in Frank's chest, not the ache of loss, but something softer, like the glow of a lantern on a stormy night. David had done this, had ensured his grandfather's story wasn't forgotten. Frank's lips twitched, a silent acknowledgement of the boy's love. The Admiral's voice softened further, almost maternal. "You should have called us, Chief." Frank met her eyes, seeing not just an officer, but a fellow servant of the sea, someone who understood the weight of duty. He nodded, unable to find words, as the crowd began to disperse, their whispers carrying fragments of his story into the town. Later that day, another figure approached the dock, unaccompanied by the usual fanfare. Eli Grayson, the billionaire whose yacht had collided with the Harbor Angel, stood before Frank, stripped of his usual entourage, his hands empty of the champagne glass that seemed glued to them. His designer suit looked out of place against the salt-stained wood, and his face bore the weight of something unfamiliar, regret. "McAllister," Eli began, his voice low, almost swallowed by the lapping waves. "I came to apologize." The crowd, lingering nearby, fell silent again. Their curiosity piqued. Frank regarded Eli steadily, his expression unreadable, giving nothing away. Eli shifted, unaccustomed to such scrutiny. "I didn't know," so he continued, his words stumbling over each other, "about your service, about what that boat meant to you. I acted like a complete fool." The word landed heavily, and Eli exhaled, searching Frank's face for a reaction. Frank tilted his head, his voice calm but carrying the weight of experience. "A man learns best when the lesson's hard." Eli's lips curved into a rueful half-smile, a flicker of relief breaking through his tension. "Yeah, well, I brought this." He held out a slim envelope, his hands steady but his eyes uncertain. "It's a blank check. Whatever you think is fair. For the boat, the loss, everything. Just name the number." Frank's gaze dropped to the envelope, but he made no move to take it. The offer hung between them, tempting in its simplicity, but Frank's voice was firm. "Money won't rebuild what was lost." Eli's shoulders sagged, the confidence he wore like armor slipping away. "Then tell me what will," he said, his voice raw with a plea. "Please." For a long moment, Frank said nothing, his eyes drifting to the empty spot on the dock where the harbor angel once rested. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but resolute. "There's a bench down by the point. Wood's rotted through. Replace it. Put a plaque on it. 3 words." He met Eli's gaze, his eyes piercing. "Remember the quiet." Eli frowned, confusion etching his features, but he nodded. "That's all?" he asked, almost disbelieving. Frank's nod was final. "That's all." By dawn the next morning, Eli was at the point, sleeves rolled up, sweat beading on his brow as he worked alongside a crew to dismantle the old bench. The townspeople watched, some with skepticism, others with cautious curiosity, as the billionaire hauled lumber and drove nails, his designer t-shirt stained with effort. A new bench took shape, sturdy and simple, and at its center a small bronze plaque was affixed, its inscription unadorned. "Remember the quiet." The words spread through Havenport like ripples on the water, drawing reporters and news vans, the story swelling into a national headline. "Veteran declines fortune, asks for memorial bench." Commentators debated Frank's choice, too forgiving, too humble, too rooted in a bygone era. But none could deny the quiet dignity that radiated from him, a man who needed no spotlight to shine. Havenport itself began to change. Fishermen, once overshadowed by the gleaming yachts of outsiders, found themselves greeted with newfound respect. Tourists paused at the bench, tracing the plaques, letters, and asking locals about the man behind it. And the children, in a shift that surprised even Frank, began gathering at the dock after school, drawn to his weathered hands and the stories they spun. Tales of storms, sailors, and knots that had saved lives since Columbus's day. One cool afternoon, a week after the bench was built, Frank sat on it, a length of rope in his hands. 3 boys and a girl clustered around him, their faces intent as he guided their fingers through the loops of a bowline knot. "Been saving sailors since Columbus," he said, his voice warm with the rhythm of teaching. The girl, her dark hair framing a thoughtful face, looked up at him. "Mr. Frank, are you angry at the man who broke your boat?" Frank paused, the rope resting in his lap. The question stirred something within him, and he considered it carefully, his gaze drifting to the sea. "No," he said at last, his voice steady, carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much to hold on to anger. "I'm not." The children nodded, accepting his answer with the simplicity of youth, and Frank resumed the knot, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The sun hung low over the harbor, casting a golden shimmer across the water, as if the sea itself were paying tribute to the moment. Frank McAllister sat on a weathered bench by the dock, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sky kissed the waves. His weathered hands, etched with decades of labor and love for the sea, rested quietly in his lap. The children seated around him exchanged glances, their young eyes bright with a kind of understanding that only the innocent can muster. a silent acknowledgement of the man who had shaped their small world in ways they were only beginning to grasp. Frank's heart, heavy with the weight of loss and time, stirred faintly. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a faint smile tugged at his lips, softening the lines of a face carved by years of storms and sacrifice. A week later, the harbor buzzed with life. Gulls screeched overhead, their cries mingling with the rhythmic slap of waves against the docks and the hum of townsfolk going about their daily routines. Frank sat on a new bench, its polished wood gleaming under the afternoon sun, positioned where his old boat once moored. A bronze plaque on the bench bore the simple words, "Remember the quiet," a tribute that seemed to hum with understated reverence. In his hands, he held a length of rope, his fingers moving with the practiced ease of a man who had spent a lifetime at sea. A small group of children gathered close, their faces alight with curiosity as he taught them the art of tying a clove hitch. "Not too tight now," Frank said, his voice low and steady, like the tide itself. "You want it to hold firm, but you've got to respect the rope. Give it room to breathe." His hands guided theirs, patient and deliberate, as the children leaned in, wide-eyed and absorbed. Their small fingers fumbled at first, but Frank's calm encouragement steadied them. To the kids, he wasn't just an old sailor. He was a living story, a bridge to a world of wind and water they longed to understand. Nearby parents watched with quiet smiles, their hearts warmed by the unexpected bond forming between their children and the grizzled man on the dock. They saw in Frank a kind of wisdom that didn't demand attention, but commanded it all the same. A quiet strength that had weathered more than just storms. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, Frank's grandson David appeared at the end of the dock. His face held a spark of mischief, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Grandpa," he called, his voice carrying a warmth that made Frank's chest tighten with affection. "Come with me. We've got something for you." Frank raised an eyebrow, his weathered face creasing with curiosity and a touch of skepticism. "Oh, what kind of trouble have you stirred up now, boy?" he asked, his tone gruff but laced with fondness. David chuckled, undeterred. "Just come. Trust me." With a little help from David's steady arm, Frank rose from the bench, his joints protesting but his spirit willing. The children followed, their whispers and giggles trailing behind like a soft breeze, as if they were in on a secret too big to contain. They wound their way along the dock, the harbor's familiar scents, salt, fish, and weathered wood, filling the air. When they reached the marina's edge, Frank stopped dead in his tracks. His breath caught, a sharp hitch in his chest, as his eyes fell on the sight before him. Out on the water, gliding toward the dock with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly, was a wooden boat. Its sleek lines and polished curves gleamed in the fading light, a vision of craftsmanship so familiar it stole the air from Frank's lungs. It was the Harbor Angel, not the original, lost to time and tragedy, but reborn. Every detail, from the gentle arc of the bow to the sturdy set of the mast, whispered of the boat he had once poured his heart into. Yet this one was new, alive with modern touches that spoke of care and collaboration. David's voice broke the silence, soft and reverent. "She's not exactly the same, Grandpa. We found your old plans tucked away in the shed. The local boat builders came together, the veterans group donated materials, and even some of the Navy boys came back to lend a hand. We added a few things, radar, new lights, but she's yours." Frank stood frozen, his heart pounding as the boat eased up to the dock. An American flag fluttered proudly at the stern, catching the last rays of sunlight. His hands, trembling with a mix of awe and disbelief, reached out to touch the polished rail. The wood was smooth under his calloused fingers, warm as if it carried the spirit of every journey he had ever taken. A voice called from the deck, bright and familiar. "Permission to come aboard, Chief?" Frank looked up to see a Navy officer at the helm, his grin widening and genuine. For a moment, Frank couldn't speak, a lump rising in his throat, thick with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He nodded once, his voice rough but steady. "Permission granted." The crowd that had gathered on the dock erupted into applause, their cheers filling the harbor with a warmth that seemed to wrap around Frank like an embrace. Tourists clapped, their faces bright with admiration. Fishermen raised their caps, their weathered hands a silent salute. Even a few of Eli Grayson's yacht guests paused to watch, their hands shielding their eyes against the sun. Eli himself stood further down the dock, his expression unreadable, a mix of admiration and a newfound humility that he hadn't known how to express before. For years, Eli's wealth and influence had cast a long shadow over the harbor, but in this moment, he was just another man, witnessing something greater than himself. Frank stepped aboard, his movements slow and deliberate, as if afraid the dream might vanish under his weight. His hand trailed along the rail, his feet finding their place on the deck with an instinct born of decades at sea. He closed his eyes, letting the gentle creak of the wood and the soft whisper of the water wash over him. The empty ache in his chest, carved out by the loss of his old boat and the life it represented, began to fill. It wasn't just wood and sails beneath his feet. It was a piece of his soul, reclaimed. David climbed aboard behind him, his grin as wide as the horizon. "We couldn't let you stay on land forever, Grandpa," he said, his voice thick with pride and love. Frank chuckled, the sound low and warm. "No, I suppose you couldn't." That evening, as the sun slipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, Frank took the Harbor Angel out for her first sail. Families gathered on the dock, their faces alight with joy as they watched the little boat glide through the water, her sails catching the breeze with a grace that seemed almost alive. The children waved wildly, their shouts carrying across the harbor, their small hands a testament to the lessons Frank had shared. David stood at the end of the dock, his arms slung casually over Eli's shoulder. The two men, from worlds as different as the sea and the shore, had found an unexpected kinship. Their shared effort to rebuild the Harbor Angel had bridged a gap neither had anticipated, a quiet reminder that connection could grow in the unlikeliest of places. As Frank sailed past the bench on the point, his eyes caught the bronze plaque, its words glowing faintly in the last light of day. "Remember the quiet." He smiled, his hand steady on the tiller, the other resting briefly on the flag at the stern. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of a lifetime, of service, of sacrifice, of a love for the sea that had never wavered. From the shore, a young father crouched beside his daughter, his finger pointing toward the boat slicing through the water. "See that man out there?" he said, his voice soft but firm. "He's the reason we have this bench, this harbor, this boat. It's more than just wood and sails, sweetheart. It's a piece of our town, of who we are." The little girl squinted into the fading light, her small face scrunched in thought. "Is he a hero, Daddy?" The father smiled, his eyes never leaving the boat. "Yes, sweetheart, he is." Out on the water, Frank turned his gaze to the open sea where the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky. The breeze filled the sails, the Harbor Angel leaning gently into the wind, as if eager to carry him forward. Alone at the helm, Frank let out a long, slow breath, his heart swelling with a peace he hadn't known in years. He had never sought to be remembered, never asked for recognition. Yet here, in the quiet rhythm of the waves and the steady hum of the boat beneath him, he felt seen, not as a man who had once served, but as a man who had never stopped. As he guided the Harbor Angel back to shore under a sky scattered with stars, Frank's journey was more than a return to the sea. It was a reclamation of dignity, of belonging, of the quiet strength that so often goes unnoticed in a world that values noise and flash. In a society that often overlooks the steady, unspoken contributions of those like Frank, his story stood as a reminder that true character is found in the small, steadfast actions that shape a lifetime. For many older Americans, Frank's experience might echo their own, a quiet ache of being unseen in a world obsessed with youth and speed. But Frank showed that one life, lived with loyalty and humility, could still ripple through a community, touching hearts and reminding them to pause, to see, to remember.